Good morning.
Morning.
That's so much fun. Thank you. My name is Matt Krogh. I'm the Extreme Oil Campaign Director for a nonprofit called ForestEthics. We're based out of California, Washington State, and British Columbia. And I have been tasked to give you sort of the lay of the land, the roots of the issue right now, some of the trends that we're seeing around the country, both the US and Canada, and also what's happening with some of the key issues and some of the responses to those issues. One of the things some of you may have noticed is that I work for a group called ForestEthics. We don't have oil or trains in our name. And we got to this point of working on this issue because we've been trying to protect boreal forests in Canada for decades. And it turns out that underneath the boreal forests lie the tar sands. And the tar sands, of course, have incredible impacts on communities who live there. They have climate concerns. They're very, very toxic oil. So we originally got into the business of fighting tar sands by trying to stop pipelines. And some years ago, it became clear that trains might be the outlet valve in the future if we were to start winning on pipelines. Has anybody here had a recent pipeline win? Yeah. There are multiple more pipelines on the books that people are fighting, but the reality is that when we look down the tracks, we may have an issue with tar sands trains coming. So we started looking around what we could do to deal with the issue. And in that time, the Bach information that Mark was just describing to us started being tapped, and more trains were coming, transporting what we call extreme oil. So the tar sands and the Bakken both we consider extreme oil because of their impacts on the environment during extraction, their climate impacts, and their toxicity. So I'm the Extreme Oil Campaign Director. We came for the tar sands, and we're staying for the rail safety fight. That's why our organization's part of it. But I have a personal vested interest in the safety of what we do with hazardous materials. Sorry, this one actually gets me. On June 10, 1999, a pipeline exploded in Bellingham, Washington, where I live. And this is the almost exact vantage point that I had. And my daughter's preschool is the house in the foreground. We actually lost 3 kids that day in Bellingham. And since then, there's been a real commitment in Bellingham, of all places, and for myself as well, to deal with hazardous material safety. And in fact, Mark mentioned pipeline safety. The Pipeline Safety Trust, which is the only third-party pipeline overseer in the country, is based out of Bellingham because of this accident. So Mark also alluded to unit trains of oil. And they are really what has made the difference in the ability of this industry to grow. He mentioned 100 cars. There's 30,000 gallons each per car. That's 3 times more than in a tanker truck. But it's the economies of scale associated with these trains that made this entire industry possible. And the only way they can move these trains is if they actually have terminals that can receive them, whether a refinery or a separate terminal. And here's an example of what one of those looks like. They're giant. You're talking about 2 or 3 miles of track in one place. The ability to offload that train. What you see there is a 1.5 mile long train that's going to go through that facility, get offloaded, and be able to transfer oil either to a pipeline or a receiving facility, a refinery perhaps. And when we see what's happened over the years, and I'm going to talk a little bit about information gap a little bit later, but this is from the Energy Information Agency, and we think about the numbers Marcus mentioned, 9,500 tank cars going to 493,000 tank cars. It's actually a vast increase in transport of oil trains along specific routes. So you see 2010 on the left, barely any trains moving at all in this country. When you look to the right, what you see is a bunch of trains coming right through here, going to Philadelphia, going to New Jersey, going to Delaware. If we had looked at the ones in between, you would have seen a big arrow pointing to California. The flexibility of the rail system is also part of what makes this oil train issue so, I was going to say volatile, so interesting, right? Because when you build a pipeline, it goes from one point to another, and it always goes from that point to another. With rail, if they can build terminals all over the country, there's always flexibility depending on where the market demand is. Oh, and that bottom part of the graph, that's the output from the Bakken that we're seeing. It's gone more and more coming out. We expect it to rise, hopefully. Hopefully not. So this is a super interesting map prepared by our friends at Oil Change International, and what you see are current and proposed onloading and offloading terminals all over North America. The rail network that you see there provides the kind of flexibility that I was just referring to, but most of these routes aren't used, and I'll show you the routes that are used in a second. But what you see, normally I can point to the screen, what you see up top on the upper left are all the onloading terminals that have been constructed in the Alberta tar sands area. Down below that, that big clump there, that's North Dakota. And if you think back to that map that we just saw of where the oil trains are running according to the EIA, you can see where the terminals are on the East Coast and in the South, which are largely unused right now for the most part, and proposed terminals on the West Coast that we're fighting that we think are really going to be targeted at bringing tar sands to Pacific markets. And so this is a map that we prepared at ForestEthics. One of the things that any advocate or anybody who's working in a municipal government has probably discovered by now is that the railroads don't want to share information with you. Any information. They don't want to share routes. They don't want to share oil spill response plans. They don't want to tell you what's in the tank cars. They really want to keep it quiet. And so we went about trying to make our own map. What current rail routes are being used for oil trains around the country. We call it the blast zone map. I'll explain that in a second. But you can see it's a much smaller subset of the rail that we saw in the previous map. And we went through, and the only way we were able to do it, we found one article on Trains magazine that created the baseline for the main trunk routes. And then we started asking people, has anybody here actually sent in additions or corrections to the blast zone map over the years? We've had hundreds and hundreds of people write in and offer up that they're watching the train go by their house today. And so we go and we add that train line in. We also recently have had the ability to access some state level information that has showed us where these trains are going in just a couple of states. But it's probably the most accurate map out there of where these trains are going. And one of the things that you can't see on that, because it's just a map of rail lines, is all the people that are in there. There are 25 million people who are living within a mile of these rail routes in the US, and there are 5 million people in Canada. You can also interact with the map a little bit. You can zoom in. If you haven't been to blast-zone.org, I encourage you to go take a look. This is where we are right now. And one of the reasons why we care about this blast zone, and we'll hear about it a bit later from the emergency responders, the emergency response guidebook, if you have a derailment of a single tank car or a tank car from a truck, filled with oil, recommends a half-mile immediate evacuation. But if there's more than one car, if there's more than one car punctured, or if there's a pool fire, which has happened in almost every one of the accidents we've seen, you get a mile or more evacuation. And so when we talk about a mile evacuation zone, or which we call the blast zone, that's why we're talking about a mile. It's been more in other places. In Castleton, North Dakota, that was the first picture that I showed you. They had a 5-mile evacuation downwind because of the toxic cloud. And further, it's not just 25 million people. One of the questions is who those 25 million people are. And as we look at the blast zone around the US, we find that 60% of the people in those communities qualify under environmental justice criteria based on race or income, children under 5, language isolation, they call it one of the categories. So looking at this, it's an amazing thing. We actually started doing detailed maps for a variety of areas. This one is Oakland. And what you see highlighted there are the environmental justice communities are actually clustered in and around the tracks. And so when we think about any risks associated with this industry, the oil train industry, you have to understand that there are disproportionate impacts on people who are at risk. Normally by this now in my presentations, I've actually shown 6 or 7 pictures of explosions. I want you to imagine that I've already done that, and now I'm going to tell you, but it's not just explosions. Every train that comes through your town has the potential and has unmitigable impacts, whether it's carcinogens coming from what they call fugitive vapors out of the tank cars, diesel particulates, the PM 2.5 micron particulate matter that actually has direct impacts on lungs. Emergency blockage, emergency response is already compromised, in particular in those environmental justice communities we talked about, further compromised by giant trains coming through and blocking crossings. And this particular picture is actually super interesting for those of us who are working on tar sands. Much of the conversation that you've heard so far, as you pay attention around the country, about rail safety or oil train safety is around tank cars. In large part, that's because of this tank car rule that just came out in May. And we know that the .111s that Mark talked about have been, the National Transportation Safety Board has been encouraging getting rid of them since the early 1970s when they were being created, at least for the purpose of hazardous materials. This is the new, latest, greatest CPC 1232. It was issued originally in 2011. It had a thicker wall, it had all these different things they talk about for tank car standards, and it blew up while transporting tar sands, diluted bitumen. So many of the thoughts that people have had about what is and isn't safe, where safety could lie, and it turns out it's not in the tank cars, it's not in the new tank cars, and it turns out that one of the products that we thought was more stable, diluted bitumen or tar sands, may be just as volatile as the Bakken crude. So as we think about safety standards going forward, and Mark also mentioned that there's a new tank car design out there, the .117. That one also has a puncture velocity, it's their engineering term, in the teens mile per hour. So it's around 15 or 16 miles per hour. And these trains are going 40 or 50 miles an hour all over the country. People are standing up. This is one of the trends that you're going to see, and you're going to see it all over the country. 2 summers ago at Forest Ethics, we helped coordinate the first week of action, we called it. It commemorated the tragedy in Lac Mégantic on July 6th. And we had 60 communities turn out. Over the ensuing year, we got more and more folks involved. This year we had 100 communities turn out for the week of action. People are standing up and they're fighting back. They're seeing the impacts and the risks associated with oil trains. They're seeing their opportunities, which we're going to hear about from Janie in part, to actually do something at a local level and a local permitting level to stop these new terminals. If you don't build those terminals, the trains won't come. And this is the cover of a report, which says Deadly Crossing. It's not quite all on there. It just came out on Monday, and it was really inspired by the work of folks in Wisconsin and Minnesota who are looking, who's here from CARS? Yeah? There we go. Hey, good crew. These folks have done an amazing job highlighting the risks associated with the failing infrastructure that we've got that these oil trains are traveling over. And particularly, we look at bridges, one of the most complex points on any part of the rail system. They're there because they're going over waterways, they're going over highways, they're going over downtown areas, and the risk of a real oil train catastrophe when something happens on one of these bridges is high. Finally, getting just about to the end, there's so much we don't know. And as we look going forward with advocacy at the municipal level, trying to work with the railroads, we don't know how they're making their routing decisions. And Fred Millar, who's in the room here, has highlighted a bunch of these hidden documents of the railroads. We don't know where they're getting their insurance, what their worst case scenario looks like that they're getting that insurance based on. We don't know what's actually in the tank cars. All we have is the single 1267 placard, which could label any number of products that are petroleum products that are all dangerous in different ways, and different ways that matter to first responders. We don't know when they're coming. We don't know in what volumes they're coming. And these sorts of issues, this sort of darkness of the data is something that a lot of us in this room are going to be working to overcome and make sure that we actually get the facts out to as many people as possible. So finally, one of the questions is, I think Mark mentioned the false dichotomy, or Grant mentioned the false dichotomy. This is extreme oil. When we talk about oil trains, we're talking about oil that is expensive to produce, extremely volatile, and it's something we simply don't need. What you see on this chart is the decline, going to 2012, of consumption of petroleum in this country. It's come back up a little bit since 2012, but the reality is that less than 5% of the oil that we're consuming is being transported by rail. That's about 1 million barrels a day. And we're exporting 3 to 4 million barrels of refined product every day. This is oil that we simply don't need. So finally, I'm going to turn it over to Janie Heinz. I'm super excited she's here. One of the first things that comes up in every conversation with people is this issue of preemption, where the railroads and the federal government will tell you you can't do anything about this issue. And I'm hoping to hear from Janie that that's simply not true. So thank you.